Obedience to authority and Stanley Milgram's experiment. We are not constantly aware of the influence other people have on our attitudes and actions. This influence can either be direct or indirect. Someone may simply tell you what to believe and what to do, but under what conditions do you obey them? Hello students, today we are going to learn about obedience, authority, negative and positive obedience, and Stanley Milgram's experiment and how it relates to German Nazism. So, after this lesson, you will be able to identify the various examples of authority in your life, illustrate the Stanley Milgram's experiment, understand why people obey to other people's orders, and comprehend how Stanley Milgram's experiment relates to German Nazism. Every one of you has had authority figures in your life. For example, your parents, your teachers, the police officer, manager, judges, or doctors. Obedience to certain authorities can be useful or destructive. For example, obeying to the orders of a doctor or firefighter in an emergency would be constructive. However, today we're going to learn about the negative aspects of obedience. Okay, so we know from such cases in history as in German Nazism that humans can obey to irrational commands. In fact, people can obey authority even when it goes against their whole system of morality and beliefs. This is where the most famous investigations of obedience conducted in 1963 by social psychologist Stanley Milgram takes place. Stanley Milgram is the picture from your left. Stanley Milgram was also a teacher at Yale University. Milgram was influenced by the events of the Holocaust, especially the trial of Adolf Eichmann, which is your picture to the right. The Stanley Milgram's experiment was created to explain some of the concentration camp horrors of World War II, where Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, slaves, and other enemies of the state were slaughtered by Nazis. The argument was the following: were the Germans in fact cruel and cold-hearted, or is this a group phenomenon which could happen to anyone given the right conditions? And how far were people willing to go in order to obey the commands of an authority figure? So, the experiment was set up as follows. There were two subjects, which are the teacher and the learner. The volunteers of this experiment were told that they would be participating in an experiment to test the effects of punishment on memory. One of the subjects was to be the teacher and the other the learner. But in reality, the learner was not a volunteer. He was Milgram's accomplice. First, the teacher was to read a list of words into a microphone for the learner, who would be in a nearby room strapped into a chair which had simulating cords strapping him and his hands, which had wires that were connected to the machine the teacher had to use, simulating an electric shock machine. So as I was saying, the teacher was supposed to read a list of words into a microphone for the learner, who was in the other room, to memorize. If the learner failed to recite the list back correctly, the teacher was to administer an electric shock. The purpose, they told the volunteers who didn't know the true purpose, was to test whether the shock would have any effect on learning. In actuality, however, Milgram wanted to discover how far the teacher would follow his instructions, and how much shock would he be willing to give a fellow human being. As the experiment began, the learner continually gave wrong answers on purpose, and the teacher began to administer the prescribed shocks from an impressive looking shock generator. The generator had a dial that ranged from 15 volts, which was labeled slight shock, to 150 volts, which was labeled danger, severe shock. After each of the learner's mistakes, the teacher was told to increase the voltage by one level, and with that increasing the severity of the shock. The teacher believed that the learner was receiving these shocks because he had seen the learner being strapped into a chair in the other room. In reality, however, the accomplice was receiving no shocks at all from the equipment. As the experiment progressed, the learner made many mistakes and the teacher had to give him increasingly shocks. At 300 volts, the learner pounded on the wall and protested and refused to provide any further answers. At this point, the experimenter instructed the subject to treat the absence of an answer as a wrong answer, and to continue the session. The experiment ended either when the maximum 150 volts, which was administered, or when the teacher refused to administer any more shocks. If at any point the teacher indicated that he wanted to stop, the experimenter calmly told him to continue whether the learner likes it or not. The experimenter also asserted you must go on until he has learned all the word pairs correctly. Okay, before Milgram began this study, he had checked with 40 psychiatrists in order to get their predictions. These experts thought that most people would not continue beyond the 150 volt level, and that only 1 in 1,000 would actually give the highest shock. Yet, in Milgram's experiment, more than half of the 40 subjects gave the full shock. These volunteers who served as subjects were not sadist people. They were ordinary people, salesmen, engineers, postal workers. Many of them showed signs of extreme tension and discomfort during the session, and they often told the experimenter that they would like to stop. But in spite of these feelings, they continued to obey the experimenter's commands. So the question here is, what accounts for this surprisingly high level of obedience? Part of the answer is that the experimenter represents a legitimate authority. People assume that such an authority knows what he's doing even when his instructions seem to go against their own standards of moral behavior. Milgram's subjects would have walked out at any time, Milgram's subjects could have walked out at any time. They had nothing to lose by leaving. However, social conditioning for obeying legitimate authorities is so strongly reinforced in people that often they lack the words or the ways to do otherwise. Simply getting up and leaving would have violated powerful unwritten rules of acceptable social behavior. So now, going back to German Nazism, Milgram stated, could it be that Adolf Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them accomplices? Were Germans just particularly obedient to authority figures? Okay, now, referring to the experiment, subsequent experiments show that there were 3 ways in which subjects could be helped to resist authority in this situation. One was the removal of the physical presence of the experimenter. Even more effective was putting the subject face to face with his victim. The third and most effective variation of the experiment was to provide other teachers to support the subject's defense of the experimenter. Okay, so to better understand this subject or this experiment, I left you here a video, and if you have any questions, you can email me.